Good evening. I'm Michael Smerconish in for Chris Matthews. Leading off tonight, back on the stand. For a second day, Rachel Jantel, who's been described as the prosecution's key witness, underwent a long and grueling cross-examination in the trial of George Zimmerman. Zimmerman, of course, is accused of murdering the unarmed Trayvon Martin early last year. Defense attorney Don West worked tirelessly to exploit holes in Jantel's testimony, trying to discredit the young woman who was the last person to speak to Martin moments before he was killed. And in fact, as he did yesterday, West exposed a number of inconsistencies in Jantel's numerous efforts to describe what happened that night. But what is not as clear is whether West managed to successfully challenge the core of her story, that George Zimmerman stalked Trayvon Martin moments before their fatal confrontation. Joining me now, MSNBC legal analyst Lisa Bloom and former Florida Circuit Court Judge Alex Ferrer. Judge Alex, is she as integral to the prosecution of this case as we have all made her out to be?
She absolutely is. I mean, she is the key witness. She was talking to him at the time of the confrontation, or right up to the confrontation. She provides a lot of detail that the prosecution would love the jury to believe. She testifies about the fact that Trayvon Martin says to Zimmerman when he supposedly approaches him, "Why are you following me?" And Zimmerman responds, "What are you doing here?" And it kind of buttresses their claim that Zimmerman is the one who went over to check out what is Trayvon Martin doing, despite the fact that the operator said, "Don't approach him, we don't need you to do that." She adds some additional language that we hadn't really heard before, where she says that right before the phone went dead, she hears Trayvon saying, get off, or "get off me," words to that effect, which certainly implies, and the logical interpretation is, he's been jumped by George Zimmerman, which goes along with prosecution.
Totally, I heard you say repeatedly on the Today Show and on MSNBC, and that is that her credibility is in the eyes of the beholder. Yes. On the radio today, it broke on racial lines. I said that I thought yesterday she was a weak witness, and I was overwhelmed from calls by African Americans today who said, "You're completely misreading the situation."
Yes, overwhelmingly on social media and elsewhere, a lot of people have expressed support for her. They feel that she was being almost abused on the witness stand. It was harassment. It was too much. It's not fair. People don't understand her. You know, I look at this through the framework of a criminal trial. This is a murder trial. Every witness who tells a story is going to be cross-examined in the same way that she was. And yet she has elicited a lot of sympathy. She's a 19-year-old young woman who just finished her junior year of high school. She cannot read cursive handwriting. She had to admit, even though she signed a letter that was written in cursive by a friend, and she had the friend write it. So this is a young woman with perhaps some learning disabilities. There were perhaps some language issues. And as you say, there's been a strong sentiment in her favor.
But if it's the case, Alex, that it breaks along racial lines in terms of how people interpret her testimony, we need to remind folks that this is a jury of 6 women and no African Americans.
Well, that's absolutely true. But I don't think that this jury is going to say, "Oh, well, we're white and Zimmerman's white, so we're going to go along those lines." But they are going to have a harder time understanding the cultural differences that the audience out there is understanding. And that is absolutely true. She did herself a lot of disfavors yesterday because of her attitude and the way she came off on the stand, because if the jury doesn't like her, they're less likely to believe her. Now, they may not like her and say, "I still believe her," but you don't want that acts against you if you're the prosecution. You want the jury to like and relate to your witnesses, and they may have had a hard time yesterday, an easier time today.
You know, I would add to that you can like her and still not believe her, because I think where the defense is going with her testimony is she was trying to help the Martin family, and that's why her story has evolved, because she felt sorry for them. Initially, she said she thought this was just a fight, and that's why she didn't call the police. Now she comes in and says that he was being stalked, and the final words were, "Get off, get off." And so I think the defense can characterize this in a way that's respectful to her, but that also makes their point.
In this morning's testimony, defense attorney Don West tried to establish a string of inconsistencies in Rachel Jantel's descriptions of events. Here's one.
You lied because you wanted to give a plausible answer to Ms. Fulton as to why you didn't go to the wake.
Yes, sir.
But on the April 2nd interview, you were in fact under oath.
Yes, sir.
And you knew that.
Yes, sir.
And you made a decision then, because of how difficult the situation you had just been put in, you decided to lie about going to the hospital rather than say something that might be painful.
Yes, sir.
Lisa Bloom, if likability is a factor in this, I think that Don West and Rachel Jantel have some degree of parity. I thought he went too far today, too long-winded, and could have shut down that cross-examination a lot sooner.
Well, he was not concise, and you lose people's attention, and you lose their affection when you repeat the same point over and over again, and that's what he did. Listen, I'm a trial lawyer. I'm watching this case every minute of the day. I can make a list of all the discrepancies that he got out of her, but I don't think most people, even the jurors, are watching that closely and analyzing that closely. Most people are watching this case, sitting back and trying to get the point, and you just lose the forest for the trees.
He'll bring it together in closing. Closing is when he's going to get up there and say, remember these discrepancies? She never said this before until after she met with Mr. Crump or after she met with it. One of the things that really stood out to me was the police, the first time they interview her, she's a crucial witness, pick her up along with Trayvon's mother and Mr. Crump, the family lawyer, take him over to Trayvon's mother's house, and she sits there and gives an interview to the police. And basically, this is an eyewitness or an ear witness to a murder, okay? They're interviewing her with the victim's mother sitting there. I've never heard of that in the criminal prosecution. No police department would ever take the witness that they want to interview and decide if they're going to prosecute and bring the family of the victim and sit them next to him. It really gives a bad light to the prosecution.
At another point in the trial, the defense attorney in this case, Don West, tried to poke holes in Rachel Jantel's description of what she heard on her end of the phone during that last call with Trayvon Martin. Let's listen.
So the last thing you heard was some kind of noise, like something hitting somebody.
And Trayvon got hit. Trayvon got hit.
You don't know that, do you?
No, sir.
You don't know that Trayvon got hit.
He could. He had.
You don't
to.
know that Trayvon didn't, at that moment, take his fist and drive it into George Zimmerman's face.
Please lower your voice.
Do you?
No, sir.
Lisa, in her testimony, she also related that she heard the sound that she ascribed to wet grass. And that was one of those moments yesterday when all of a sudden my antenna went up and I thought that sounds like the sort of thing you pull from a police report or a media report. And again, phone callers to me said, you're being too harsh on her.
Well, you know, there's two different languages being spoken here, right? Rachel Jantel speaks the language that people outside of the courtroom speak. It sounded like wet grass, right? In a courtroom, you have to be very, very precise. What exactly was the sound? You don't really know that he was hit, do you? Because you couldn't see anything. You're making an assumption. Most of us in normal conversation, we make assumptions all of the time. She's not familiar with the courtroom and the rules of evidence, and of course Don West is.
Alex, listen to this. Let's everybody watch this bit of her testimony so that they know what I'm talking about.
Are you saying that the sound of wet grass that you used to describe this yesterday, as you describe it today, you're saying that you believe that was people rolling around on the ground?
Yes, sir.
And what's that based on? What is the sound you heard that led to that conclusion?
I really don't know how to describe it.
Alex, how do you read that?
Well, I mean, it's a fair question. When you say something like, you know, I heard the sound of wet grass, he's going to come after you and go, what does that sound like, and how have you ever heard it, to say that over the phone, in the background, you're going to be able to tell people are struggling. The thing here is, this is the prosecution side of the case. This is the part of the case where we should be going, wow, this is a powerful case against George Zimmerman. Because when they get to the defense side, it's going to eat away at the prosecution side. And every witness the prosecution has called has given a point for the prosecution and maybe a point or two for the defense. So they're in a tough position.
To that issue, Lisa, I believe I'm getting the entire defense version of this without George Zimmerman testifying. And I forget what the word choice was, cold cock or sucker punch.
Sucker punch.
Sucker punch. You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
There was that moment when Don West, in a question to her, says something to the effect of, what if there had been a sucker punch thrown at George Zimmerman? And I thought, well, geez, Zimmerman doesn't have to take the stand now because the jury just heard this.
I think you're putting your finger on one of the really interesting issues in the case, which is, will George Zimmerman testify? I think the defense wants to keep him off the stand because they don't want him to be cross-examined. He's got inconsistencies in the stories that he told. He wrote out a department right after the incident. He's submitted to a videotaped interrogation the next day, and there are inconsistencies. Perhaps they're innocent, perhaps he was telling lies. I think the defense would love to get the videotaped statement in, or even the handwritten statement in. They may not be able to do that themselves because it could be hearsay. The prosecution may get it in. I mean, all of this is a little bit of legal gamesmanship, but it remains to be seen. I think the prosecution wants to force the defense's hand and make him testify.
Alex, at the end of today's testimony, it was the woman who logged the 911 call where in the background you heard the plea for help. And as you well know, the expert testimony was disallowed, and yet the jury has heard that tape repeatedly. I think that's significant. I think that they will each bring their lay experience and try and analyze who is crying for help, and that could be outcome determinative.
Well, if they could identify who was crying for help, it absolutely is outcome determinative. End of the case. They can't on an expert level, as you and I have discussed before, and it was right to keep the expert testimony out. It was not reliable testimony. But what you're left with is this wailing on the tape, which is very impactful. The jury heard it. I'm sure they reacted to it no matter how many times they hear it. And then you're going to hear Trayvon's parents get on and say, that's my child, even though Tracy, the father, has said in the past that's not Trayvon's voice. He now is on board that it is his voice, and maybe he reconsidered it. You're going to have Zimmerman's parents saying that's George's voice. Neither of them have probably ever heard their child screaming in a panic state for their life. So how certain they are and how much the jury will give, how much weight they'll give to that, I don't know. It may end up being a wash at the end of the day.
Lisa, the lawyering in this case, just have a minute left, but are Mark O'Mara and Don West involved in a good cop, bad cop routine?
That's an interesting perspective. I don't think so. I think they're both fine defense lawyers. Certainly Don West has made his mistakes. The knock-knock joke, he tends to run on far too long, too long-winded. All right, but he's making some really important points, and he's trying to save his client from 25 years to life in prison. So he's doing his job.
It's really great to see both of you, Lisa Bloom and Alex Ferrer. I appreciate your having been here.